Attention! Today, we invite you to step into the pockets, the pay envelopes, and the real lives of working Americans 100 years ago. To understand not just what the numbers were, but what those numbers meant when your children were hungry, when winter was coming, when the rent was due. This is 1920, and America stands at a crossroads. The Great War has just ended. Women have finally won the right to vote. Prohibition has just begun. The nation is transforming from farms to factories, from candlelight to electric light, from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles. But amid all this change, one question haunts every household. Will we have enough? But before we begin, let's create something special. Write in the comments your city, country, and the exact time right now. Right now, not later. I want to know who exactly, in what corner of the world, at what moment in time, is starting to listen to this story. This will be like a time capsule. It's 6:30 on a Monday morning in Pittsburgh. The alarm clock jangles in the darkness. John Murphy doesn't need it. His body already knows. 48 years old, steel mill worker, father of 5. He swings his legs out of bed, and his feet touch cold linoleum. The room smells like coal smoke and yesterday's cabbage. His wife Mary is already in the kitchen. You can hear her moving around downstairs, the scrape of the stove grate, the pump handle squeaking. John earns $42 a week. Remember that number. $42. It sounds impossibly small now, but let's understand what it meant then. He works 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. That's 72 hours of standing in front of blast furnaces where the heat reaches 2,000 degrees, where the air is so thick with smoke and coal dust that you cough black phlegm for hours after your shift, where men lose fingers, lose eyes, lose their lives. Just last month, a ladle chain snapped and molten steel splashed across the floor. 2 men burned. 1 lived. 1 didn't. But $42 a week in 1920. That makes John Murphy one of the fortunate ones. Let's talk about what America actually earned in 1920. Not the averages you find in history books. Not the sanitized statistics. The real numbers that determined whether your family ate meat once a week or once a month. Whether your children had shoes that fit or shoes stuffed with newspaper to cover the holes. The average industrial worker earned about $25 per week. But averages hide everything that matters. They smooth out the suffering and the success into one meaningless number. A coal miner in West Virginia might earn $3.50 for a 10-hour day underground. If he worked 6 days a week, that's $21. But that's if the mine was operating full-time, if there wasn't a strike, if he didn't get sick, if the company didn't dock his pay for the tools they rented him, for the powder he used to blast the coal, for the company store credit he was forced to take instead of cash. You descend into darkness at dawn. The cage drops so fast your stomach lurches. At the bottom, 3 miles of horizontal shaft stretches before you. You can't stand upright. Your back stays bent for 10 hours. The only light comes from the lamp on your cap. The air tastes like stone and dynamite. Water drips constantly. Your clothes never dry. The sound of your pickaxe echoes and echoes. And every moment, you know that the mountain above could decide to fall. That the timber supports could crack. That gas could seep from a fissure. And one spark would end everything. For $3.50 a day. Now let's go north. A textile worker in a Massachusetts mill, a young woman named Rosa, recently arrived from Italy. She speaks broken English. She's 19 years old. She tends 4 looms simultaneously in a room so loud that the roar physically hurts. The air is thick with cotton dust that coats your lungs, that makes women cough until they're 40 and can't work anymore. the machinery has no safety guards. Last year, a girl Rosa's age got her hair caught in a belt drive. They shut down the line for 30 minutes to clean up. Then everyone went back to work. Rosa earns $12 per week. She shares a 3-room apartment with 7 other people. Not her family, just other immigrants who needed a place to sleep. They work different shifts, so they share beds. When Rosa comes home, someone else gets up to go to work. The apartment smells like too many bodies, like the toilet in the hallway that serves 4 apartments, like boiled potatoes and desperation. $12 per week. That's her entire worth to the world, calculated and paid. But we haven't talked about the lowest rungs yet. The people whose labor built 1920 America, but whose earnings were designed to keep them permanently beneath. A black sharecropper in Mississippi, working land he'll never own, might clear $200 for an entire year of work. After the landowner takes his share, after the cost of seed, of tools, of the shack he lives in is deducted. $200. That's less than $4 per week. For dawn to dusk labor in fields where the sun burns like judgment, and the overseer's grandson watches with the same eyes his grandfather used during slavery. This isn't distant history. This is living memory. This is your great-grandparents' world. A domestic worker, a black woman in Atlanta, earns perhaps $6 per week cleaning someone else's home. She washes their clothes, cooks their meals, raises their children. She enters through the back door. She eats different food from a different plate. She uses a different bathroom. And at the end of the week, $6. Sometimes $5. Sometimes paid in old clothes and leftover food instead of cash. And she says thank you because there are no other options. Because that $6 feeds her own children. Because this is 1920 in the South. And survival requires swallowing your dignity daily. Let's shift perspective now. Let's talk about the other America. The one that doesn't ache at the end of the day. Let's shift perspective now. Let's talk about the other America. The one that doesn't ache at the end of the day. A bank manager in New York City earns $60 per week. His hands are soft. His back doesn't hurt. He wears a suit that cost more than a coal miner earns in a month. He eats lunch at a restaurant where the tablecloths are white linen and the waiters are black men who call him sir and earn their living from tips. A doctor might earn $5,000 per year. That's nearly $100 per week. He owns his home. His children attend private schools. His wife doesn't work, which is itself a luxury that announces his success. She has a domestic worker who comes 3 days a week, who earns that $6 we talked about. A successful lawyer or businessman might earn $10,000 per year or more, nearly $200 per week. These are the men who own the mills where Rosa coughs cotton dust, who own the mines where men die for $3.50 a day, who sit on boards and attend meetings and make decisions about efficiency and profit margins that translate directly into whether someone else's child gets milk this week. This is the machinery of 1920. Not evil, exactly. Just indifferent. Just mathematical. Just the way things are. Now let's understand what these wages actually bought. Because $42 or $12 or $6 mean nothing without context. A loaf of bread costs 7 to 10 cents. A gallon of milk is 55 cents. A dozen eggs, 68 cents. Ground beef is about 35 cents per pound. A pound of coffee, 47 cents. John Murphy, our steel worker earning $42 per week, he's feeding 7 people. A rough calculation. Food costs about $15 to $20 per week for a family his size, if they're careful. If they eat a lot of potatoes and cabbage and beans. If meat appears on Sundays only. If the children drink watered-down milk. Rent for their apartment. 4 rooms in a building that houses 8 families, $20 per month. Coal for heat in the Pittsburgh winter. Another man to manage a store. A secretary or typist in an office earns $12 to $15 per week. She must dress well, which costs money. She must be courteous, which means accepting behavior from male bosses that would get them arrested on the street. She must be perfect. One mistake, she's replaced. There are 20 women waiting for her job. Now let's talk about race explicitly, because we can't understand 1920 economics without understanding how race determined everything. A black Pullman porter working on luxury trains might earn $67 per month. That sounds reasonable until you understand he works 400 hours per month to earn it. That's about 17 cents per hour. He sleeps in cramped quarters on the train. He's expected to be invisible, silent, grateful. White passengers call him George, regardless of his actual name. It's a joke. George Pullman owned the company, so all porters are George, erasing identity, denying humanity, for $67 per month. A Chinese laborer in California might earn $15 to $20 per week in a laundry or restaurant, if he works 12 to 14 hours per day, if he's lucky enough to find work at all. The Chinese Exclusion Act ensures he can never bring his wife to America, never become a citizen, never truly belong. He sends money back to China. He saves every penny. He lives in a single room with 3 other men. The smell of steam and soap and loneliness. A Mexican field worker in Texas or California earns perhaps $2 to $3 per day during harvest season. But harvest season doesn't last all year. The rest of the time, nothing. He follows crops north, lives in labor camps where 20 people share an outdoor privy, where water comes from a single pump, where children die from diseases that rich people don't even remember exist. This is the reality beneath the Roaring Twenties mythology, before the jazz and the flappers and the speakeasies. In 1920, most of America is still working itself into an early grave for wages that barely sustain life. Let's ground this further. Let's watch money actually move through a family's life. It's Friday evening. John Murphy stops at the mill office and receives his pay envelope. $42 in cash. He can feel its weight. This is the entire week's survival, tangible in his calloused hand. He walks home through streets that smell like coal smoke and horses. At the grocer, he hands over $2 for food for the weekend. At home, Mary takes the envelope. She's already calculated everything. $20 immediately set aside for rent, due Monday. $3 for coal. Winter's coming. She gives John $1 for his weekly necessities, tobacco, and a beer or two at the corner tavern. She gives each of the 3 oldest children a nickel. She puts $15 in the coffee tin for food for the coming week. That leaves $1. One single dollar for the unexpected, for the shoe repair, for the medicine, for the impossible dreams. This is prosperity, 1920 style. This is a good union job. This is what working-class success looks like. Compare this to today. The minimum wage in most of America is around $7.25 per hour. 40 hours per week is $290. That's about $1,260 per month. In 1920 terms, John Murphy earned about $180 per month. So modern minimum wage is about 7 times higher, right? But let's look at purchasing power. Bread that cost 10 cents in 1920 costs about $3 today. That's 30 times more. Rent for John Murphy's apartment was about $20 per month. A comparable apartment today costs anywhere from $800 to $1,500. That's 40 to 75 times more. The cost of living has outpaced wage growth dramatically. But here's what's profoundly different. In 1920, if you got sick, you either paid a doctor in cash or you died. There was no health insurance for working people. Hospitals were where poor people went to die, not to heal. Today, despite all our struggles with healthcare costs, the basic assumption has changed. We believe healthcare is something everyone deserves access to. That belief didn't exist in 1920. In 1920, there was no social safety net, no social security, no unemployment insurance, no food stamps, no welfare. If you couldn't work, you starved. Your family starved. Maybe a church would help. Maybe neighbors would help. Maybe. In 1920, there was no paid vacation for working people, no sick days, no personal days. You worked until you were too sick or too injured to work, and then you hoped you didn't die before you could work again. In 1920, retirement meant working until you physically couldn't anymore, then depending on your children or dying. The idea that society owed elderly people dignity and security didn't exist yet. That came later, built on the suffering of the generation that lived through 1920 and the Depression that followed. The 40-hour workweek didn't exist. The weekend as we know it was a radical dream. Workplace safety regulations were minimal to non-existent. If the mine collapsed, if the machine caught you, if the molten steel splashed, that was God's will or your own carelessness. The company bore no responsibility. Child labor was normal. Children died in factories and mines, and society shrugged. Their deaths were sad, certainly, but also inevitable. The cost of progress, the price of cheap goods. This is what Americans earned in 1920. Not just the dollar amounts, but the cost extracted from their bodies, their minds, their families, their dreams. The steelworker's chronic cough that turned into pneumonia that turned into death at 55. That was earned. The textile worker's white lung disease, earned. The miner's black lung, earned. The domestic worker's bent back, her swollen knees from scrubbing floors, earned. All of it earned. All of it paid for with pieces of human life. So that's what Americans earned in 1920. Not just wages, but a glimpse into a world where human labor was cheap and human life was cheaper. Where the machinery of industry ground people up and replaced them without pause. Where race determined not just your opportunities, but your fundamental worth in society's eyes. Where women were paid half what men earned for the same work because society believed they were worth half. Where children worked because families had no choice, and society looked away because acknowledging the horror would require changing it. 42 million Americans worked in 1920. The average annual income was about $1,200. But that average meant nothing. It hid the banker earning $10,000 and the sharecropper earning $200. It smoothed over the reality that half of America lived in what we would now recognize as poverty, that millions lived in conditions we would consider uninhabitable, that working yourself to death wasn't a figure of speech, but a literal truth. What changed? Unions first, workers organizing, striking, sometimes dying for the right to negotiate collectively. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911 killed 146 women and finally sparked outrage enough for reform. Slowly, gradually, the 8-hour day, the 40-hour week, workplace safety laws, child labor laws with teeth. These didn't happen because corporations suddenly grew consciences. They happened because workers demanded them, voted for them, fought for them. The Great Depression exposed the lie that poverty was individual failure. When a third of the nation couldn't find work, society had to admit the system itself was broken. That's when Social Security arrived. Unemployment insurance, labor protections. The New Deal didn't solve everything, but it established the principle that society had obligations to its most vulnerable members. The Civil Rights Movement challenged the racial hierarchy that kept Black Americans earning half what white Americans earned for the same work. That denied them education, opportunity, dignity. The progress was painful, incomplete, ongoing. But the conversation changed. The legal structures changed. The possibilities changed. The women's movement challenged the assumption that women's labor was worth less than men's, that women existed primarily as wives and mothers rather than as full human beings with their own ambitions. Again, incomplete progress. But progress. We stand now on the foundation built by the people who earned those 1920 wages, who worked 12-hour days and died young and watched their children go hungry, who fought for unions and were beaten by company guards and police, who struck and starved and demanded better. Not for themselves, always. Often they knew they'd never see the benefit. But for the future, for us. This is American Tales, real stories, real numbers, real lives. If you enjoyed this, write in the comments. Did anything surprise you? What do you want to learn about next? Subscribe for more stories about real American history. Not the textbook version, the truth. Thank you for being here. Thank you for wanting to know the real story. See you in the next tale.